Hello again, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. This section of the course is going to focus on the topic of attitudes, that is, our evaluations of some aspect of our social world. We're going to look at three different research streams, three different lines of research that have examined attitudes the past half century. The first of these, we'll look at the attitude to behavior link. The attitude to behavior link, this is all about, do our attitudes, our evaluations of things, tend to predict what we do relative to that thing? So I feel a certain way about something, does that then predict or have a relationship with how I act relative to that something? The second line of research will flip that around. Rather than looking at the ability of attitudes to predict behaviors, we'll see, well, do behaviors predict attitudes? Is it also possible that I've acted in some way and then that will subsequently influence my attitude about that certain thing? This is going to be the area of research where we have one of the greatest debates in social psychology, the debate between cognitive dissonance theory and self-perception theory, and we'll examine that debate and who's winning that debate in great detail. And then our third line of research will be on persuasion. Persuasion would be effortful attempts to get somebody to change their attitude. Sit back, relax, enjoy our discussion of attitudes, and hopefully you'll have a positive attitude about it when we're all done.
Attitudes are simply evaluations of various aspects of our world. So either positive or negative or neutral aspects of something that we find in our social world. Evaluations of people and places and things, stuff like that. There are three components of attitudes: affect, behavior, and cognition. So once again, we see the influence of the ABCs in psychology. Essentially, what we're saying here is that you can see someone's attitude about some topic, their positive or negative or neutral evaluation of some topic, based on their affect, their emotional response to that topic, based on their behaviors, what they do, their actions relative to that topic, and then their cognitions, the things that they think about that topic. Now, you don't necessarily have to have all of these components to have an attitude, but most strongly held attitudes will have ways that they influence our attitudes, ways that influence our behaviors, and ways that influence our cognitions. In terms of the valence or value of attitudes, we want to talk about three different types. You can have positive attitudes, negative attitudes, and ambivalent or neutral attitudes. I don't think that there's anything earth-shattering about the fact that some attitudes are positive or negative. This would be a general overall positive impression of something, attitude about something, or a general overall negative attitude about something. I don't think that's interesting. I think what is worthy of note is the fact that some attitudes are ambivalent. They're like in the middle or so-so. Sometimes when you ask individuals what their attitude is about something and they say, well, I don't really care for that one way or another. I don't really have an attitude. Actually, the fact that they don't care one way or another is their attitude. It's their ambivalent attitude. If I ask you to rate a restaurant on a 1 to 9 scale, 1 you hate it, 9 you love it, and you circle a 5, something right in the middle, that doesn't mean you don't have an attitude. It just means that your attitude is so-so. It's in the middle. It's ambivalent. The first line of research that we'll examine involves the attitude to behavior link. Essentially, this line of research examines whether or not attitudes predict behaviors. That is, does how I feel about a topic, my positive or negative evaluation about that topic, have a relationship or a bearing on how I act relative to that topic? Now, intuitively, it would seem that there'd be a very powerful relationship between attitudes as causal factors for behaviors. For example, I like dumplings. I have a very positive attitude evaluation towards dumplings, so I eat there a lot. I don't like Dancing with the Stars, so I never watch it. On a very basic surface level, it does seem that attitudes should be predictors of behaviors. But the real question then is, just because they seem like it on the surface, is that actually the case? Throughout the decades in social psychology, there have been literally dozens and dozens and dozens of different studies that have examined the attitude to behavior link. That is, literally dozens of studies that have tried to figure out, do attitudes predict behaviors, and if so, how well? The research by Krauss in 1995 is particularly informative here, because what Krauss did was he conducted a meta-analysis on this research. Now, before we describe the results of Krauss's study, we need to talk briefly about what a meta-analysis is. A meta-analysis is simply where you're going to gather every single piece of published and unpublished research you can find on a topic. And you're going to combine all of that data together into one giant or meta-analysis. It's a really great way to do research because it takes out different specifics that you might otherwise have as confounds in research. For example, I could do a study at Murray State University on whether or not attitudes predict behaviors, and that would be fine and dandy, and I would have my 80 to 100 subjects. But if I do a meta-analysis, I can take all of these studies conducted all across the globe and have one giant overall conclusion. It's a very powerful way of doing research because it generalizes across all different sample types. So with this basic understanding of what a meta-analysis is, we can now talk about Krauss's results. Here's what he found when he looked at all of the research he could find, again, dozens and dozens of studies, looking at the attitude to behavior link, looking at whether or not attitudes predict behaviors. His conclusion from his work was that yes, attitudes do predict behaviors. Across all samples and situations, more often than not, how you feel about something, your positive or negative attitude about something, your evaluation will predict, will reflect what you then subsequently do relative to that something. In general, attitudes predict behaviors. However, they don't predict behaviors all the time. They usually do, but they don't always predict behavior. So Krauss would then say that yes, attitudes predict behaviors, just maybe not as often as people would think that they do. So based on Krauss then, we would say that although attitudes often predict behaviors, they don't always do so. This is actually a critical point because when individuals assess attitudes, like through a questionnaire or through an interview, usually they're doing so because they want to use that information to predict what that person will do later on. For example, think about organizations. When organizations assess attitudes within that organization, for example, job satisfaction, which is simply your attitude about what you're doing at your job, when organizations assess that, they're doing so because they're not just curious about if people like what they're doing, they want to be able to predict how hard people will work later on based on that information. So the better we can get the ability of attitudes to predict behaviors, the better off we're going to be. Thankfully, there are things that we can do that improve this relationship. There are things that we can do that improve the abilities of attitudes to predict behaviors, and that's what we'll talk about next. One important thing to focus on when trying to figure out ways to get attitudes to be better predictors of behaviors is the fact that we need to do all we can to measure the individual's real attitude. Now that seems pretty straightforward, but the reality is, as I mentioned before, we usually assess attitudes through questionnaires and interviews, and we know people tend to lie on these things. There's ways to make yourself look better based on your answers to these questionnaires and interviews. Well, if you're not being fully honest in your attitude because you're saying the socially desirable response, we're then going to try and predict your behavior on something that isn't actually your attitude. That's not going to work out very well. The importance of measuring a real attitude in order to get the best possible prediction of future behaviors was perhaps best shown in a series of studies known as the bogus pipeline technique studies. In these studies, they would have individuals complete questionnaires very early on in the semester that would measure all different kinds of aspects of attitudes, things about like the death penalty or gun control, stuff like that. Then later on in the semester, they would be invited back into the lab for what they were told was a completely separate study. Actually, they were connected, but they didn't know that. So they're brought back into the lab, and they're shown what is essentially going to look like to them a machine that's going to be like a lie detector machine. They're told that this machine is able to, based on very minute changes in the individual's muscles, detect their attitudes about topics like yes or no, pro or con, for or against, things like that. So they're sat down with this machine, they're hooked up to this machine, and they're told, the subject is told, well, first of all, we want to make sure that the machine is working right. So we're going to ask you a question, and we don't want you to say your answer out loud, but just think about your attitude about this topic, and we'll see if the machine's calibrated right and working right today. And then they would ask the subject a question. Well, there was a needle on this machine that would move like from left or right, be like yes or no, pro or con, for or against. And while the person is sitting there thinking about their attitude towards this question, sure enough, that needle moved exactly in the right direction. Now, of course, what actually had happened was they had asked that question several months earlier, so they plugged in the machine and they knew exactly what they were going to think. That's not what the subject thought, right? The subject is hooked up to this machine and they're thinking, oh my God, this machine is reading my mind. Basically, this subject is thinking, I'm hooked up to a lie detector test. So the researcher looks at the subject and says, so did that work? And the subject is like, oh my God, yes, that thing actually knew exactly what I was thinking about. That's exactly what my attitude is towards that topic. Okay, good. Now we're all set. So then the researcher would move that needle so that the subject couldn't see it. Well, of course, because they only plugged in one answer. And now we have two different conditions in the study that we can talk about. We have the condition where the subject is hooked up to the machine and is being asked a series of questions. And then we have another condition where subjects are answering the exact same questions in pencil and paper format. What they found was subjects who answered hooked up to the machine when asked questions about race relations were much more honest, in other words, negative, about their impressions and ideas and feelings about other races. Those who were answering these same exact questions on pencil and paper seemed so nice, so outgoing, so progressive in their attitudes and positive in their attitudes towards other races. That's because those who were answering it on the pencil and paper questionnaire, they thought they could get away with making themselves look extra nice. So look, here's the point. The point is not that to get people to be honest, you got to hook them up to things like the bogus pipeline and trick them. That's not the point. The point is, if you want to have attitudes predict behaviors, you got to figure out a way to get the individual to give you their real attitude, their honest attitude. You don't have to necessarily hook them up to a machine, but just tell them things like, look, your attitude won't be held against you. You can be honest. Nobody will know what you're going to say, things like that. If they feel that they can be honest, if they feel that they can be truthful and they'll give you their real attitude, then that real attitude will do a much better job of predicting their real behavior down the road. If they don't give you their real attitude, then how is that going to predict their future behavior? It's not. It's like if I asked Bob his attitude and he gave me something and I decided, oh, I'll take Cindy's attitude to predict Bob's behavior. Either way, it's not Bob's attitude predicting Bob's behavior. You have to get their real attitude for it to work at an optimal level. The issue with attitude specificity is making sure that we are going to assess the attitude and the behavior at the same level of specificity or the same level of generality. You can't have a specific attitude and a general behavior or vice versa and think it's going to work out. If I want to predict a specific behavior, I have to assess a specific attitude. If I want to predict a general behavior, I have to assess a general attitude. So for example, let's say that I want to predict the extent to which an individual watches some specific reality show, let's say Survivor. It's not going to work if I assess their general attitude about reality TV. I can't ask people how they feel in general about reality TV and have that do a nice job of predicting whether or not they watch a specific reality program, Survivor. If I want to predict if somebody watches Survivor, I have to assess specifically their attitude about the show Survivor. Now that seems pretty obvious and pretty intuitive. The reality is most questionnaires that are already out there are general in nature, and the researchers try and cheat and not make up their own items. So they'll sometimes get lazy and say, well, I'll just use this general measure and then predict this specific behavior. Doesn't work out very well. If you want to increase the ability of attitudes to predict behaviors, make sure you're assessing the attitude at the same level of specificity as you are assessing the ultimate behavior. Another way to improve the ability of attitudes to predict behaviors is to focus on minimizing other influences. What this is all about is so many different things can impact what we do. And sometimes these external forces can minimize what seems to be otherwise a pretty good predictor of attitudes to behaviors. What's going on here is that when you ask people, why didn't you do this if you feel this way? Often what they'll say is, well, I couldn't, or all things being equal, if I would have been able to, I would have. It's not that they didn't act in a way that matched their attitude. They would have if they could have. It's just that so many other forces are going on that even though they wanted to act in a way that reflected their attitude, something or some things stopped them from doing so. I think a pretty good example of using the minimalization of other influences to improve the ability of attitudes to predict behavior is to look at people's favorite sports teams. So oftentimes when I'm lecturing on this in class, I'll ask people who has a favorite sports team, and probably about 2/3 of the class will raise their hand. And I'll find somebody whose favorite sports team is a long way from Murray, Kentucky. Let's say that somebody is their favorite sports team is the Green Bay Packers. I'll say, how much of a Packers fan are you? Like, oh, I love the Packers. They're my favorite team. So I'll say, you got a very positive attitude, a positive evaluation about the Packers, right? And they'll say, yeah, I live for the Packers. Okay, so then how many games did you go to this year? They almost always say none. And I'll say, well, that doesn't seem like you like the Packers at all. That seems like your attitude is not predicting your behaviors at all. They always say the same thing. Well, I don't live in Green Bay. If I lived in Green Bay, I'd go to lots of Packers games. Well, there you have it, right? This fact that they don't live where the team is residing, that's an other influence that you got to minimize. All things being equal, if they live by the Packers, they would go. My favorite restaurant I've only eaten at 4 times in my entire life. It's Parrot Key. It's on a Disney cruise ship. If that restaurant happened to be in Murray, I'd weigh like 3,000 pounds. The reason that my attitude doesn't predict my behavior very well, the reason that I've only eaten at my favorite restaurant 4 times is because it's on a boat and I don't live on that boat. You minimize that influence, you'd maximize the size of my stomach. Attitudes gained through direct experience usually have a better relationship in terms of attitudes predicting behaviors. There's actually a couple of ways you can gain an attitude. Sometimes you gain an attitude because of things that have happened to you through your own direct experience. So you go to a restaurant 3 times, and every time you have a bad meal, you develop a negative attitude about that restaurant. But maybe you had a friend that went to this restaurant 3 times and had a bad meal. You're still probably going to gain a negative attitude about the restaurant, but this time your attitude was not gained through direct experience. It wasn't gained through things that happened to you. Research shows that when an attitude is acquired, is established through something that's happened to us, through direct experience, then that attitude is much more likely to predict subsequent behavior. A pretty good example that helps us understand the impact of direct experience on attitudes predicting behaviors would be to think about somebody taking a class. Let's say that somebody has taken a certain professor for 3 different classes and all 3 times had a negative experience. Didn't like the professor, didn't get good grades, didn't really understand the material. There was a bad relationship between the professor and the student. Now that student is looking to take another class the following semester and see that that professor has a class that's being offered that that student has not taken. There's very, very little chance that that student is going to take that class because that student has a negative attitude about that professor that was acquired through direct experience. But if that student was talking to somebody else, and that somebody else like, yeah, I've heard that this professor is teaching this class, what can you tell me about the professor? And that person says bad things about that professor, that will decrease the chances that that second person takes that professor's course, but not as much, right? I mean, if you had a professor that you hate 3 times, you're never taking that person again. If you know of a professor that a friend has taken 3 times and they hate, you're less likely to take that professor, but you still might take him because that negative attitude was not gained through your own experience. If you gain that negative attitude with that professor through your own direct experience, you're never taking him or her again. Another critical factor in improving the ability of attitudes to predict behaviors is to pay attention to vested interest. Vested interest is simply, does this scenario matter to the individual? Whenever the situation at hand matters to us, in other words, whenever we have a vested interest in the situation, whenever what's going on is going to impact our lives, we're much more likely to act in a way that fits our attitudes. Our attitudes will be a better predictor of behaviors if the scenario that's going on, if the environment that we are in, if the situation that's unfolding matters to us. We have a vested interest. A good example that underscores the importance of vested interest would be to look at whether or not Western Kentucky University adopted some type of school uniform policy. Let's say that Western Kentucky decides, yes, all of the male and female students have to wear these silly, ridiculous uniforms to school or they won't be allowed in class. If I asked you what your attitude about that was, almost every student at Murray State would say, well, I think that's a terrible idea. I have a negative attitude about that. Then I would say, well, how many of you went to Western Kentucky to Bowling Green and picketed? Nobody did, because you don't have a vested interest in that scenario. That's not your school. But if Murray State adopted the exact same policy, all of a sudden now you're picketing. All of a sudden now you're just screaming at the top of your lungs about how unfair and ridiculous this policy is, because all of a sudden now it matters to you. Your attitudes will predict your behaviors in the second scenario, the Murray State scenario, because, well, you're a student at Murray State. You have vested interest in this new policy. Your attitude predicts your behavior because it's important to you. What's going on matters to you in your life. A final factor that can improve the attitude to behavior link, the ability of attitudes to predict behaviors, is to actually purposefully bring the attitude to mind. We're talking here about how your brain likes it easy. Law number 2, we're cognitive misers. We don't want to think any more than we have to. Sometimes our attitudes don't predict our behaviors because we don't put forth the cognitive effort that's required to actually think about what we think about that topic in the first place. We don't put forth the cognitive effort that's required to bring the attitude to mind. So we're unaware, at least consciously, about our attitude, and then we do things that don't match that attitude. As an example of the importance of bringing the attitude to mind to improve the attitude to behavior relationship, think about a scenario where you may have found yourself in, where you're at a restaurant with some of your friends and you're having a really good time talking and waiting for the meal, and all of a sudden the food arrives and you look down at what you've been brought and you think to yourself, why in the hell would I order that? I don't even really like that. Or why did I order that? I came here specifically to get something else. That's because when you were placing your order, maybe you didn't actually take the time to bring the attitude to mind about what you wanted to order in the first place. So many times in our lives we think to ourselves, oh, why in the hell did I do that? Probably because you didn't think what you thought about that topic in the first place. You didn't bring the attitude to mind. If somebody would have said to you, hey, are you sure you want to order that? I thought you didn't like that. You'd say, oh yeah, oh my God, I don't know what I'm thinking about. Then you bring the attitude to mind and you actually do something that reflects that attitude. You act in a way that is consistent with that attitude. The second research stream to examine attitudes within social psychology has examined the behavior to attitude link. Specifically, do behaviors predict attitudes? I think that certainly this directional pattern is a little less intuitive. It seems a little less obvious than the other one. It seems like it makes more sense to us to think that attitudes predict behaviors than behaviors predict attitudes. It seems to make more sense, seem more logical that I feel a certain way about something, I have an attitude about something, and therefore how I feel, that attitude predicts what I do relative to that something. It seems less obvious to us that, well, I've done something, and then because of what I've done, I've then changed my attitude as a consequence of those behaviors. But the reality is, research would suggest that this direction, behaviors leading to an attitudinal change, are just as likely as scenarios where attitudes lead to a behavioral change. The question isn't, do behaviors lead to a change in attitudes? The question isn't, do behaviors predict attitudes? They do. The question rather is, how does this occur? And in social psychology over the decades, there have been two competing theories to account for, to explain the situations, to explain the process through which behaviors predict attitudes. These two theories are cognitive dissonance theory and self-perception theory. The first approach to understanding how behaviors can lead to a change in attitudes is Leon Fessinger's theory of cognitive dissonance that he developed in the 1950s. There are a lot of different components to cognitive dissonance theory. It's fairly complex. We'll discuss each of these components below and then tie it all together with a final example. Fessinger's theory of cognitive dissonance starts with the belief that humans desire a state of cognitive consistency. Cognitive consistency simply means that we want to find ourselves in scenarios where our attitudes and our behaviors match. Our attitudes and our behaviors are congruent, or they're similar. They fit together. Basically, this is saying that we will feel a certain way about a topic and act a certain way about a topic, and that those two things will be the same, that our attitudes and our behaviors will match. They'll be consistent. That's cognitive consistency. Unfortunately, sometimes we find ourselves in scenarios where our attitudes and our behaviors don't match, where our attitudes and our behaviors on a certain topic don't fit. They're not congruent. That's a scenario where we are said to be experiencing cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance, therefore, happens when our attitudes and our behaviors don't match. The result of cognitive dissonance, the result of finding ourselves in situations where our attitudes and our behaviors are incongruent, they don't match, is unwanted tension and arousal. So basically what we're saying here is that when we have cognitive dissonance, when our attitudes and our behaviors don't match, along with that, we experience unwanted tension and arousal. It's unwanted Therefore, we're going to try and get rid of this tension and unwanted arousal. The tension and arousal that arises from cognitive dissonance is unwanted. These experiences of unwanted tension and arousal, therefore, are things that we're going to want to get rid of. Basically, you have two general options for getting rid of this unwanted tension and arousal that arises from scenarios where your attitudes don't match your behaviors. One option is to change your attitude, to change what you feel or think about a scenario. The second option will be to change your behavior, how you're acting relative to that scenario. If it's your attitude and your behavior that is incongruent, that's leading to the unwanted tension and arousal, well, then what are you going to do to get rid of the tension and arousal? You can change one or the other, change the attitude or the behavior to match the other one. Oftentimes, we find that individuals will change their attitude. This is because, A, sometimes it's easier to change your attitude. Sometimes it takes less effort to change what you're thinking than it does to change what you're doing. Second of all, sometimes it's the fact that you'll change your attitude rather than your behavior because you can't change your behavior. The behavioral sequence is already done. That's no longer an option. Putting all the components of cognitive dissonance theory together then, it works something like this. Fessinger begins his approach by arguing that humans have a desire to maintain cognitive consistency. We want to find ourselves in scenarios where our attitudes and our behaviors match. They're congruent, they're consistent. Sometimes, however, that's not the case. Sometimes we act in ways that are inconsistent with how we feel about a topic. Our behaviors and our attitudes don't match. In those scenarios, we are said to be experiencing cognitive dissonance. Therefore, cognitive dissonance occurs when our attitudes and our behaviors don't match. What happens when we have cognitive dissonance is it leads to unwanted tension and arousal. We feel these sensations of unwanted arousal. We feel tense, and we don't like it. Since we don't like it, we want to get rid of it. To get rid of the unwanted tension and arousal, we have a couple of basic choices. We can change the attitude to match the behavior, or we can change the behavior to match the attitude. Oftentimes, we'll choose to change the attitude because it's easier or the behavioral sequence has already been completed. For example, let's say that somebody and his 3 friends head to Paducah to go bar hopping. He's up there having a really good time, and they're all getting really good and liquored up, and all of a sudden, he gets a text on his phone about 11 o'clock at night that says, hey, they're having a massive party here at Itampa Kega Fraternity at Murray State. Come on down and join us. So then he and his friends pile in the back of his Pinto, and away they head back to Murray. About halfway here, he realizes, oh man, I'm drinking and driving, and I think drinking and driving is really stupid. So he has this attitude of drinking and driving is dumb, but he has the behavior of I'm drinking and driving. That inconsistency between his attitude and his behavior will lead to cognitive dissonance, and that cognitive dissonance will lead to unwanted tension and arousal. It's unwanted tension and arousal. He doesn't want the tension and arousal, so he has a couple of options he could do to lower the arousal and get rid of the dissonance. One, he could change his behavior. He could say, well, I'm just going to pull over and let somebody else drive, or I'm going to let one of these other people drive, or I'm going to call a friend, or I'm going to call a cab. Since it's Murray, I think it's calling the cab. Anyway, these are some behavioral options he could take. He could also change his attitude. He could change what he's thinking. He could say, well, I'm not near as think as how drunk I am, or I'm a better option than the 3 guys that are passed out in the back of my Pinto, or I've been drinking and driving before and I'm still alive. All of my friends have done it. Shit, half of them are still alive. At the end of the day, it's probably easier for him to change his attitude, right? It's easier to change what he's thinking than it is to change what he's doing. Therefore, his behavior of driving in a way that's inconsistent with his attitude of not thinking you should drink and drive, that behavior is changing or leading to a change in attitude. Or maybe he doesn't think about this inconsistency until the next day when he wakes up and he thinks to himself and thinks, man, I was drinking and driving last night, and that's really stupid. Well, he can't change the behavior, right? It's not like he can drive backwards to Paducah from Murray and it's okay. No, the behavioral sequence is done. It's come and gone. All that's left at that point is to change the attitude. You probably say to himself, well, I'm okay. Must not be that big a deal. Must not be that bad to drink and drive. In the following slides, we're going to investigate and examine 3 different types of cognitive dissonance: insufficient justification, effort justification, and post-decision dissonance. There are a couple of reasons why social psychologists like to talk about different types of cognitive dissonance. First of all, by talking about and examining the different types of dissonance, you can show students the different types of experiments that have been used to support the hypotheses found in this theory. Second of all, by talking about different types of cognitive dissonance, you can show the wide range of social psychological phenomena that are explained by this theory. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at the different types of cognitive dissonance. In Festinger and Carl Smith's study, we have three different groups. Group 1, we're going to label the control group. Group 2, we'll call the $1 group. And Group 3 will be the $20 group. And over to the right, you'll see a diagram where we list these different groups. And then on the following slide, we'll talk about on this diagram exactly what the results were. Participants were randomly assigned to one of the three groups. So we have a true independent variable here. And the first thing that the individuals in these two groups did were several boring tasks. For example, they would take spools of thread and put it on a tray and take it off of a tray, and they would have a pegboard and have to turn these pegs a quarter of a turn and then do it again and again. They did each of these two boring tasks for 30 minutes. So basically what they did was they sat down and did two meaningless tasks for a total of 1 hour. And that was done by members of all three conditions, Group 1, Group 2, and 3. The first thing they did was 60 minutes of these boring tasks. Once the participants had finished the two boring tasks, the researcher then pulled them aside and said, okay, so here's what this study is all about. So there's actually two groups. There's people in a condition such as yourself who basically have no expectations about what's going to happen here. You didn't know anything up front about what you're going to do in this study. We just brought you in and then you did these tasks. But in the other condition, we actually have subjects who are given some upfront information. They're given some information about what's going to happen and some expectancies about what's going to happen in the study that they're going to participate in. They're given some information about these tasks and what they're like. Basically, then the study is simply comparing the reactions of people like yourself in the condition where there was no expectations with people in the other condition where they actually have expectations built in. At this point, it got a bit different for the people in the control group and then those in groups 2 and 3, the $1 and $20 groups. In the control group, basically once they heard the sort of setup for the study and the point of the study and comparing people that have expectations with those that don't have expectations, they were essentially told that, okay, our part of the study here then is done. They're then informed, now, although we're done with what we're doing, you've actually signed up for a 2-hour session and we have some time left in the session. We have heard that there's another researcher who's wanting to talk to subjects about their experiences in research. We thought, well, since you've got some time left over in your session and we're already done here, maybe you wouldn't mind talking to this experimenter. Maybe you wouldn't mind kind of sharing your experiences as a subject with this second person. The second experimenter, of course, was presented as someone who was completely separate from the study at hand, when in reality, the second experimenter was a Confederate. They were a part of Festinger and Carl Smith's study. They just didn't act like it. So once the subjects were like, yeah, sure, I'll talk to the next person, they're then walked into another room where they meet the second experimenter who basically asked them several questions about the study that they had done. Essentially, what the second experimenter was asking was, what did you think about the study you just completed? Now, here's a critical point. When you think, what did you think about the study you just completed, you need to focus on the tasks. So in this experiment, the second experiment says, what did you think about what you just did? Literally think about what they just did, these two really boring tasks. So basically backing up then, the control group does these boring tasks. They're given a little bit of information about the study. We're comparing those with knowledge about what's going to go on, expectations, and those like yourself that don't. Then they're told, hey, we got some extra time in the session you signed up for. If you don't mind, can you talk to a second researcher? They're not connected to our study. Actually, they were. They're not connected to our study. They just want to know about, get feedback about subjects' experiences with studies. Subject said, sure, no problem. They met the second experimenter. The second experimenter asked them some questions. Basically, it boils down to, what did you think about the study you just did? That is, what did you think about the tasks that you just completed? The procedure for Group 2, the $1 group, and Group 3, the $20 group, was somewhat different than it was for the control group. Yes, groups 2 and 3 did the same thing to start with, right? They did the same two boring tasks, totaling for 1 hour. But then when the researcher looked at the subject after he finished the two boring tasks, the researcher says, well, so you know now that the study is about these two different conditions. That we got the group that you were in where you don't know what's going to happen, and the other group where we have some expectations. I got kind of a strange request for you. See, we use students to talk to subjects in the other condition. It doesn't seem real if we, the researchers, talk to them and tell them what's going to happen. That doesn't seem realistic or authentic. So we use subjects and to participate as the research assistant in that condition. Well, here's the strange thing I have to ask for you. The student that we have that fills that role, the student that we have that tells people in the other condition what to expect, they couldn't be here today. They're sick or something, I don't know. But there's a subject out there waiting right now that's supposed to be in that condition. There's a person out there right now who's supposed to have some information up front about what to expect. We can't do it because, again, that's not realistic. But my colleague and I thought, well, since you've now been through the study, maybe you wouldn't mind filling that role for us. Maybe you wouldn't mind talking to the next subject and letting that person know what's going to happen. Maybe you wouldn't mind filling in today. If you could do that for us, we would pay you, and they were told $1 if they were in group 2 and $20 if they were in group 3. All of the subjects said, sure, no problem. They were then basically given a script that gave them information about what they were supposed to say, information about the sort of the impression they were supposed to give to this next subject. It said things like, I had a blast. I had a great time. I sure enjoyed myself. I'm sure glad I did that. That was really informative. Really liked that. Basically, they were being asked to lie for $1 if they were in group 2, $20 if they were in group 3. So they're given a little bit of time to learn what they're supposed to say. Once they had that figured out, then they were walked into another room where they met the additional subject. Of course, the second subject was a Confederate, somebody acting like a subject, but in reality, they were part of the study along with the researchers. So they gave the real subjects about 5 minutes to try and, give their spiel and tell the Confederate subject what a great time they had. Give them 5 minutes to go through that. Then the researcher walks in, takes the Confederate subject, walks out, supposedly to start them. Of course, they wouldn't. Walk back to the real subject and say, hey, that's great. Thank you so much. Here's your money, and maybe sign a receipt. And let me get your name and your address. We can get you on a retainer in case we need to call you back. This is great. Once all that stuff was done, the subjects are then told in groups 2 and 3, okay, look, we're completely all done here. But you signed up for a 2-hour session, and there's still some time left in the session you signed up for. We understand that there's another researcher who wants to talk to subjects about their impressions of the studies that they've been a participant in. This second researcher is completely separate from our study, but since you've got some time, we thought maybe you wouldn't mind talking to this person. So now people in groups 2 and 3 are going to do the same thing that the control group did at the very end. They're going to go talk to the second researcher, who of course is actually in cahoots with Fessinger and Carlsmith. The second researcher again is going to ask them, so, what did you think of the study you just did? Basically, what did you think of the tasks that you just completed? So the first type of cognitive dissonance that we'll take a look at is insufficient justification, which is based on the work of Leon Fessinger and James Carlsmith back in the 1950s. Like so many of the different topics and studies in social psychology that we'll cover, really insufficient justification is best understood first by taking a look at the study that was designed to test and find support for this approach. So that's what we'll do here. We'll first take a look at the study that was conducted by Fessinger and Carlsmith, and then after we have an understanding of the methodology, on the following slide, we can take a look at the results and how these results help us understand insufficient justification and, in a bigger picture, cognitive dissonance. So now that we have information about the methodology, let's take a look at the results. The diagram to the right, the arrows will indicate what the subject's impressions and evaluations of the tasks were. Recall that the subjects were asked by the second experimenter, what did you think about the study you just had done? What did you think about the tasks that you had just done? An arrow down means that they didn't like the task that they had just done. The arrow up means that they liked the task, they liked the study that they had just completed. So let's now talk about how those results confirm the hypotheses based on cognitive dissonance theory and exactly why the results were the way they were. So the control group, the first thing they do are the boring tasks. Now, as soon as they're done with those boring tasks, we would imagine that their attitude about those tasks would be quite negative, right? You can imagine sitting in a room for an hour and putting spools of thread on and off a tray and turning pegs a quarter of a turn for 30 minutes. It would be terribly boring. So we would think that they would have a negative attitude about those tasks when they had finished those tasks. Now, the question is, did they do anything inconsistent with the attitude of, well, I hate those tasks, before they talked to the second experimenter? And the answer is no, right? So they finished these boring tasks. They thought, well, that sucked. And then the next thing they do is they meet the second experimenter who says, well, what did you think of the tasks? So they had no inconsistency between their attitude and their behavior. Those in the control condition had no inconsistency or a mismatch between their attitude and their behavior. Their attitude was, they hate these tasks. The behavior was nothing inconsistent with that. So they had no inconsistency between attitude and behavior. Therefore, they had no cognitive dissonance. Since they have no cognitive dissonance, they have no unwanted tension and arousal. Since they have no unwanted tension and arousal, they have no need to change anything, no need to change their attitude to match their behavior or change their behavior to match their attitude. Therefore, when the second experimenter said, what'd you think about the study? They said, I thought it sucked. Now let's take a look at the individuals in group 3. I'm going out of chronological order here because it simply makes more sense to describe this study by talking about group 3 prior to talking about group 2. In group 3, the $20 group, as soon as they get done with these boring tasks, we would imagine that their attitude would be they hate them. We actually have some empirical evidence of this. That's basically what group 1 tells us. The control group basically tells us that all things being equal, if you make college students do these 2 tasks, they're going to think they suck. So group 3's attitude, as soon as they are done, is that I hate these tasks. The question then is, did they do anything inconsistent with the attitude of I hate these boring tasks before they talked to the second experimenter? And the answer is yes, right? They had the attitude of I hate this, but they had the behavior of, they told this apparently next subject that it was a great time. The attitude, I don't like it. The behavior, I'm saying I love it. That's an inconsistency between the attitude and the behavior. But yet, when they get to the second researcher, and the second researcher says, what did you think about the task that you just finished? They still said that they were negative. Now we've got to figure out why they still said that they had a negative attitude about these tasks. So we've established that for group 3, the $20 group, there was an inconsistency between their attitude and their behavior. They would have thought, man, those tasks suck, but the behavior was, I said they were really good. The question then is, when they get to the second experimenter, why do they still think they sucked? Why wasn't there cognitive dissonance? The reason that there wasn't cognitive dissonance is because they had sufficient justification. They had a reason for why they had told this second subject that the study was a great time. And that sufficient justification is the $20. Put yourself in the position of this individual, right? You finish these tasks and you gotta hate that. And then somebody says, hey, basically, would you tell this other person it was a great time for us? We'll give you $20 if you do that. This was the 1950s, right? So we're talking 60, 70, 80 bucks today in today's dollars. And the subject is thinking, well, yeah, I'll do that. And so although there's an inconsistency between the attitude and the behavior, because they had a sufficient justification for this inconsistency, because they had a sufficient reason for the inconsistency, they did not experience cognitive dissonance. And since they didn't experience cognitive dissonance, they didn't have any unwanted tension and arousal. And since they didn't have any unwanted tension and arousal, they had no need to change something. They had no need to change the attitude to match the behavior, or the behavior to match the attitude. So that when they got to the second researcher and the researcher says, well, what do you think of the study you just did? What did you think of the task that you just did? The person in group number 3, the $20 group, says, well, I think it sucked. Now let's take a look at group 2, the $1 group. The first thing that these individuals do, again, the 2 boring tasks. What's their attitude about those tasks when they finish? Well, based on the control group, we would assume, rightly so, that they're going to have a negative attitude about these 2 tasks. They're going to think they suck. Now, the next thing they do is they are asked to talk to the next subject for $1 and tell this person what a great time they had. And then they meet with the second researcher, and the researcher says, so what did you think about the task you just did? Suddenly, group 2 shows a positive evaluation of the task that they just did. They all of a sudden like the task that they just completed. They like the study that they just did. Now let's figure out why in group 2, compared to group 1 and group 3, those in group 2 like the task. They like the study. The key to understanding the results for group 2 are, quite frankly, the same they are to understanding the results of group 3. That is, focus on the money. In group number 2, what was it that they received in repayment for telling the second subject that they had a great time? They got $1. One measly dollar. Well, if we're going to call the $20 for group 3 sufficient justification, you can probably guess that for group 2, the $1 we will call insufficient justification. $1 was not enough to justify, to give a reason for the inconsistency between the attitude and the behavior. Therefore, these are individuals who are going to experience cognitive dissonance. Group 2, their attitude is they hate these tasks. As soon as they're done, they hate these tasks. But now they tell somebody what a great time they had, but they only got $1 for doing that. That's not enough to justify what they had just said. So not only do they have in group 2 an inconsistency between their attitude and their behavior, they also now, because of insufficient justification, have cognitive dissonance. And since they have cognitive dissonance, they have unwanted tension and arousal. It's unwanted, they got to get rid of it. So when they meet the second researcher, and the second researcher says, what do you think about the task that you just did? These poor people in group number 2 are sitting there with dissonance going on, unwanted tension and arousal going on, and they want to get rid of it. Now, one general option for getting rid of the arousal from dissonance is to change your behavior. But that wasn't an option for these people, right? I mean, they've already done what they've done. They can't go running into the other room and find the other somebody and say, hey, I lied. I'm sorry. Here's the $1. Shit, here's my visa. That's not an option. The only thing they could change, the only way they could reconcile this inconsistency between the attitude and the behavior was to change the attitude to match the behavior. And that's exactly what they did. So when the second experimenter said, what did you think about the task that you just did? They said, hey, I liked them. Their evaluation of the task was positive because they had to deal with the dissonance from the inconsistency of their attitude and their behavior. Let's take a look at a real-life example, or a potential real-life example anyway, of insufficient justification form of cognitive dissonance. Let's say that I tell you, I'd like for you to come to my office with your best friend. And so you bring your best friend over to my office. Now, I'm going to assume that since they are your best friend, you have a positive attitude about this person. If you don't have a positive attitude about your best friend, get a different best friend. So you bring your best friend that you like to my office, and you walk in, and I say to you, okay, please spit on this person. And you're like, huh? I say, I'd like you to voluntarily spit on this person. And you say, okay, and you spit on them. Now I ask you, what's your attitude about this person? Based on insufficient justification, we would predict that you would have a lower evaluation, a more negative evaluation of your best friend than you did when you walked in. After all, you spit on this person. You have the attitude of you like them, you have the behavior of you spit on them, and you don't have a justification for that. You have no reason you did that. You chose to do that. So after spitting on them, you're going to think, well, I got this heaping helping of cognitive dissonance, and I got this heaping helping of unwanted tension and arousal. I can't unspit on them, so all that's left is changing my attitude. I guess I don't like them that much after all. But what if you'd have walked in and I said, hey, nice to meet you, and how are you doing? And I pull out a gun, and I put a gun to the back of your head, and I say, if you don't spit on this person, I'm going to shoot you. And you think, well, you know, I've heard from my friends and classmates that he's pretty much a crazy bastard, and he just might pull this off. So you go ahead and spit on him. And then afterwards, I say, so now you don't like him very much because you spit on him, right? You'd say, well, no, I spit on him because you had a gun to my head. The gun to your head, that's sufficient justification. That gives you a justification or a reason for why you spit on them. So even though in that scenario, The gun scenario, you have an inconsistency between your attitude and your behavior. You're not going to have cognitive dissonance, an unwanted attention arousal, and a need to change anything because you have a sufficient justification for that inconsistency, for that mismatch or incongruency between the attitude and the behavior. A second type of cognitive dissonance, effort justification, is the work of Elliott Aronson and Judson Mills. 1959 was their publication date. Similar to our discussion of insufficient justification, effort justification is best understood by going through Aronson and Mills' study, so that's what we'll do now. Once again, I've put a diagram to the right that will express and represent the methodology for Aronson and Mills. Three groups, once again, all participants randomly assigned to one of the groups. Group 1 will be our control group. Group 2, our low effort group or low initiation group. Group 3, our high effort or high initiation group. And then on the following slide, we'll add arrows indicating the results. The setup for Aronson and Mills' effort justification study goes something like this. The participants are told that they're going to be joining a discussion group, and the topic of this discussion group is sex. But they're also told that essentially they are a replacement for someone, and that the other people in the group, the other three individuals, have read the book. They've done the readings for the discussion. Well, of course, the subject hasn't done the readings, and so they are told, since you haven't done the readings and you're a fill-in, you're not going to be allowed to actually converse with the others. You're just going to listen in. This was the researchers' genius way of making it so the subject would think that the discussion was live because they were listening to it, but they wouldn't realize then that actually it was a recording. Since they were told that you're just going to listen in, here is your set of headphones, and here's your microphone, but we've turned your microphone off. You can't actually comment. So they think it's live, but in reality, every subject heard the exact same discussion. And it was set up so that this discussion was really boring. You have these three other people who are in other cubicles. Everyone's told, look, we don't want you to see everybody else because of the sensitive nature of this topic. People get embarrassed talking about sex, so we had them in different cubicles. So here's your microphone in this cubicle, and here's your headphones in this cubicle, and you can listen to what the other people are saying, but since you haven't done the reading, you don't actually get to comment. Just listen in to what others are saying. Group number 1, the control group, basically, upon hearing this setup for the study, goes straight to the discussion group, right? So once they're told, here's what's going on, here's the topic of the discussion, you're just going to have to listen in and not comment because you haven't read the material. They just walk to the cubicle and away they go. They didn't do anything. They had no effort or no initiation to join the discussion group. They were just straight put into the discussion group. Group 2 is our low effort or our low initiation group. Once they were presented with the setup of the study, they were then told, hey, look, the reality is that we get nervous when we add new members to this discussion because of the sensitive nature of the topic. So we need to have some type of guarantee that subjects don't get too embarrassed or too worried or too overwhelmed and anxious about the topic. So we need to have you do something for us to show us that you can handle this topic. So these individuals were asked to stand up in front of these researchers and basically describe words like prostitute and virgin. So they had to read these sort of sexual words, but that wasn't a whole lot of embarrassment, a whole lot of effort or initiation, just a moderate or low amount. Group 3 is our high effort or high initiation group. Similar to group 2, they were told, hey, well, we're always concerned when we add new people because of the sensitive nature of the topic, and we need to make sure that people don't get too embarrassed and they have the maturity to handle this topic. Well, group 2, they were just asked to read those simple sexual terms like virgin and petting. Group 3, their level of effort to become a part of the group was much higher. They had to read sexually explicit words. I won't say what they are here. You can look them up if you want to, but let's just say that most of them rhyme with the word truck. And they were also then asked to read a couple of paragraphs from 2 sexually explicit novels. I'm not sure what the name of the novels were. Maybe it was like that one that came out and was so popular a couple of years ago. What was that called? Oh yeah, 50 Shades of Porn. So with that understanding of the methodology for Aronson and Mills' study, let's take a look at the results. After the discussion group, after the participants listened to this boring, awful discussion group, they were asked what they thought of the discussion group. That was a dependent variable. What was assessed was their attitudes and thoughts about and evaluations of the discussion. The diagram to the right, the arrows once again will indicate what their responses were. An arrow down would be they didn't like the discussion group. An arrow up would be they liked it a lot. And the side-to-side arrow, the left-to-right arrow, would be, well, they were okay with the discussion group. Now, let's take a look at each group and figure out why the results were the way they were. For the control group, group 1, they reported that they didn't like the discussion group. And this makes some sense because they didn't do anything to become a part of the discussion group. So they have the attitude of they hate the group, but they had no behavior that was inconsistent with the attitude of they hate the group. They didn't like the discussion group. So when asked what they thought about it, they gave a negative reaction. They have a negative evaluation of the discussion group in the control group, group number 1. So group number 1, the control group, they didn't like the discussion group because they had no effort to justify. But with group number 2, the low effort group, the low initiation group, there was some effort to justify. They did have to put forth some effort, go through some sort of initiation to become a part of the group. After all, they had to stand there and say some of those terms like petting and virgin. That's not a lot, but it's some. So for this group, they had the attitude of they didn't like the discussion group. That's what the control group would show us. But yet they also had this inconsistency between the attitude of they didn't like the discussion group and the fact that they had done some things to go into the discussion group. They had done this minimal effort to become a part of the discussion group. Therefore, you have an inconsistency between attitude and behavior. For group number 2, the attitude is, I don't like this discussion group. The behavior is, I did a little bit to become a part of it. Those two things don't fit. Well, that's going to lead to some cognitive dissonance. That's going to lead to some tension and arousal. That's going to drive them to change something to have the attitude match the behavior, or the behavior match the attitude. They can't change the behavior, right? They've already said those things. They can't say them backwards and have it count. All that's left is to change their attitude. So what they have to do is they have to justify the effort that they put forth. Well, group 2, they put forth a little bit of effort, so they have a little bit of effort to justify. So when they were asked what they thought about the discussion group, they said, it was okay. I liked it a little bit. So group 1 had no effort to justify, no dissonance. They didn't like the group at all. Group 2 had a little bit of effort to justify, so they had a little bit of dissonance. They liked the group a little bit. You can now probably guess and understand why group 3, who put forth the highest level of effort to join the group, had the highest level of initiation, reported the highest level of evaluation, the most positive evaluation for the group. For group 3, they did a lot to become a part of this group. They put forth a lot of effort to become a part of this group. Therefore, they had the most effort to justify. They had the greatest inconsistency between the attitude of this group sucked and the behavior of I worked really hard to become part of this group. Once again, that's going to lead to dissonance. Once again, that leads to this unwanted tension and arousal. And once again, they got to change something. Well, they can't change the behavior. They've already said these things. They've already done these things. All that's left is changing their attitude. They got rid of the dissonance by convincing themselves that, hey, this was actually a really good discussion group. To better our understanding of effort justification, let's take a look at a couple of examples. One is what is often referred to as the IKEA effect. IKEA is this store that it takes you about 6 hours to walk through where they'll sell you furniture and housewares and things like that. The furniture, they'll ship it to your house, but it's not put together, right? You have to actually construct it, put this stuff together. They'll send you the pieces to the bed, but you got to put it together to have a bed. Well, there's two ways to buy something like that, right? You could buy it fully assembled, and you could buy it where you have to assemble it yourself. Part of the reason that IKEA is cheaper is because you got to put it together yourself. Well, they've done research that's looked at evaluations and attitudes of these different types of furniture based on if people put it together themselves or if it comes fully assembled. What they find, consistent with cognitive dissonance and effort justification, is that when individuals put the furniture together themselves, they tend to have a more positive evaluation of that furniture. To say to yourself, this furniture is a piece of shit, and it took me 3 days to put it together, that's not going to go together very well at all, right? That's going to lead to cognitive dissonance. The attitude of this piece of furniture is terrible, the behavior of I worked so hard to put it together, that's dissonance. Well, they're not going to undo what they did, right? They're not going to take the piece of furniture apart. They're rather going to convince themselves to change their attitude and say, hey, this piece of furniture is great. That's the IKEA effect, basically cognitive dissonance, effort justification. We convince ourselves that the furniture is great because after all, look how hard I put it together. Another everyday example of ever justification involves hazing. These rituals and these rites that fraternities and sororities put their pledges through in order to join the fraternity or the sorority. Now, you're not supposed to do this stuff, right? Hazing is a felony. You're not supposed to do that. But it works. Based on ever justification, we understand how. If I make an individual work really hard to join my fraternity, the harder they work, the more they're going to like the fraternity, the more positive their attitude will be about the fraternity. You're not supposed to do this, but if you do it, it'll make people like your fraternity that much more. So our third type of cognitive dissonance is post-decision dissonance, the work of Jack Brim. Brim published this work in 1956. This is based on his dissertation working under Fessinger at the University of Minnesota. Actually, this is the first ever study published on cognitive dissonance. Jack ended up at the University of Kansas. He was actually the director of the doctoral program in social psychology while I was at Kansas, so I had the pleasure of taking several of Jack's courses while I was there. Like the other two types of cognitive dissonance, post-decision dissonance seems to be easiest to understand, easiest to explain by going through the study designed to test this form of dissonance. So let's take a look and see what Brim did. The first thing that happened in Brim's study was participants were asked to rate several different everyday household items, manufacturer's items, like a toaster or perhaps a coffee maker. What Jack did then was he would look at two that were rated about the same. So let's say that on this 1 to 8 scale, they rated the toaster and the coffee maker as a 5. Jack would then tell them, okay, so as you know, in response for helping us out here, in payment for helping us out here, you're asked to pick one of the items. And they would be told that, well, here's the only ones that we have left. And so they would have to pick one of those two items that he chose because they were ones that they had listed about the same. So let's say again that they listed the toaster and the coffee maker as about a 5. Jack would say, hey, feel free to pick one to take with you. All we have left is the toaster and the coffee maker. Once the participant would have made the selection, they would have picked one of these two items to take with them that they had rated about the same. Then Jack would ask them to re-rate the items. And what he was interested in would be whether or not their rating would change from the time that they rated them prior to selecting the item. What Brim found was completely consistent with cognitive dissonance. Specifically, individuals increased their rating of the item that they chose and decreased their rating of the item that they didn't choose. This makes sense. If I think that item A and B are pretty much exactly the same, and I pick item A, to then have the attitude that item B is better would lead to a heaping helping of cognitive dissonance. If I picked A, I must think that A is better. That's exactly what they did. They changed their evaluations to match their behavior. I chose A. Oh, I really like A. I didn't choose B. Oh, I guess I don't really like that all that much. As an example of post-decision dissonance, let's take a situation where an individual is going to go buy a car. So the person has just graduated from college and their parents have said, here's $10,000 for a graduation present, go buy a car. And there's two cars that they really like. They really would like to buy this Honda and they would really like to buy this Prius. Obviously, they can't get them both. Doesn't make any sense to get them both. And when they're asked which one they like better, they say, well, you know what? I really like them exactly the same. So then they decide, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get the Prius. About a week later, someone says, so I thought you liked those cars the same. They're going to say, well, yeah, no, the Prius is a little bit better and the Honda's not quite as good. That's post-decision dissonance. They chose the Prius, and so therefore they would increase their evaluation of the Prius. They didn't choose the Honda, they would decrease their evaluation of the Honda. To choose the Prius and then also have the attitude of the Honda is better, that doesn't make any sense. So to make it all work out, to have cognitive consistency where our attitudes match our behaviors, well, then we're going to make sure that whatever we picked is what we think is the very best. There's one more topic I'd like to cover before we leave our specific discussion of cognitive dissonance, and that's the fact that although so far we've discussed two basic ways to reduce dissonance, that is, change your attitude to match behavior or change your behavior to match your attitude, the reality is there are actually other options as well. Now, the change your attitude, change behavior are the most basic options and ones that I think people most associate with cognitive dissonance. But subsequent research has found that there are other possibilities of other ways to reduce cognitive dissonance. One additional way to reduce cognitive dissonance is to acquire new information. So let's say that you choose the Prius over the Honda, and you've got a little bit of dissonance going on because, gosh, you also know that a Honda is a really good car as well. So you do some digging into the literature and you do some searching online. And you find out that, wow, these Priuses are so highly rated. They have such a high level of reliability. Consumer Reports loves them. You're acquiring new information to justify the inconsistency between the attitude and the behavior. So acquiring new information is another way to reduce cognitive dissonance. Another additional way to reduce cognitive dissonance is to trivialize, to basically say, yeah, I know that there's an inconsistency between my attitude and my behavior, but it's such a small, insignificant part of my life, I don't really care. So, for example, let's say somebody is at a party and they're drinking Coors Light because that happens to be what they have on tap. And their friend comes by and says, I thought you didn't like Coors Light. Well, so you might think that will lead to cognitive dissonance, right? They have the attitude of they don't like Coors Light. They have the behavior of they're drinking Coors Light. There's an inconsistency there. That certainly seems like it would lead to cognitive dissonance and unwanted attention arousal and all that stuff. Well, the person might say, yeah, well, it's beer. I don't give a shit, right? They would just trivialize the inconsistency. They would admit that it's there, but they get rid of the dissonance by saying, I don't care that it's there. It doesn't bother me. The third additional way to reduce cognitive dissonance is to reduce the individual's awareness of arousal. Remember, arousal is the key. This unwanted attention arousal is the driving force behind changes in cognitive dissonance theory. It's our desire to get rid of the unwanted attention arousal that leads us to change our attitude or our behavior. So if you take the individual's mind off of the arousal, you reduce the individual's awareness of the arousal, they then have less reason to change their attitude and their behavior. The arousal may be there, they're just not aware of it. And if they're not aware of it, then they won't change attitude or behavior. Research suggests there are several ways to reduce awareness of arousal. We'll talk about some of those next. 3 ways to reduce the awareness of the arousal, and therefore as an additional way to reduce cognitive dissonance. One of these 3 ways is to give this individual something super positive to do. So you have someone who is in a dissonant situation where their attitudes and their behaviors don't match. That's going to be very uncomfortable for that individual. And the reason that they want to change their attitude and or behavior is to get rid of that discomfort coming from the unwanted attention and arousal. Well, if you give that person the opportunity to do something super fun, super positive, that positive activity, that enjoyable activity then takes their mind off of the arousal, and they're no longer aware of the arousal, no longer feel a need to change their attitude or their behavior to reduce the dissonance. Second way that you can reduce awareness of the arousal is by overloading the individual cognitively. We've talked before in here about law number 3, that you have a limited cognitive capacity. You can't think about everything at once. Well, if you give somebody a whole bunch of stuff to do, like you give them a bunch of long math problems or something, and you really make them dive into this cognitive process, they're now going to use up all of their cognitive capacity pi and use it to dedicate to that cognitive task, let's say the math task. When they do that, there's no pi left to have them aware of their arousal. So you get rid of the awareness of the arousal by making them focus solely on something else. And third, and I've always loved this one because it explained my life in the fraternity for 4 years, get them drunk. Intoxicated people tend not to experience cognitive dissonance because they're not aware of the arousal. This is why drunk people can always do things that seem to go against their attitude. They're not having dissonance because they're not aware of the arousal because they're intoxicated. Earlier in this lecture, we said that there were 2 different explanations for the process by which behaviors lead to a change in attitudes. One was cognitive dissonance. We spent quite a bit of time talking about that. Let's change now and focus on the second explanation, that being self-perception. Self-perception was the work of Daryl Bem in the 1960s. Bem was a strict behaviorist, and one of the phrases that they often say in the behaviorist world is, if you can't see it, you can't study it. And so Bem came out with his self-perception theory directly against cognitive dissonance theory. And his thinking was, you can't see arousal, you can't see this unwanted tension, so I don't want to hear about it. So his theory is in direct competition then with cognitive dissonance theory. Bem's self-perception theory is really quite straightforward. Basically, he says that we learn our attitudes by watching our behaviors. So, for example, if you want to know how much I like racer basketball, you don't even really have to ask me, right? You can just watch what I do. You can see, well, does he go to the games? Does he go to the away games? Does he wear Murray State stuff? You can actually find out about my attitudes simply by observing my behaviors. Bim says we do the exact same thing for our own attitudes and our own behaviors, right? So that's the whole point behind self-perception theory. Self-perception theory is simply the fact that we learn our attitudes by watching our behaviors. I go to racer basketball games. Oh, I must like it. I go to Dumplings a lot. Oh, I must like it. I don't go to Applebee's. Oh, I must not like it. We learn our attitudes by observing our behaviors. A critical component that's missing from Bim's theory then, one that's a critical part, a major part and influence in cognitive dissonance, is the notion of arousal. Bim says there's no need for this. Bim says we have no need to include arousal in the process. You don't need to have to worry about, oh, I've got this unwanted attention arousal because my attitude and behavior don't match, so I got to change something to get rid of the arousal. No, his theory simply says I look at my behavior and from that determine my attitude. No need to talk about arousal. Parsimony is a scientific term that means simple. We like things scientifically that are parsimonious, that are simple. That's a good thing. Basically, if you have two theories and one theory has 5 steps and the other theory has 3 steps, the theory with 3 steps is more parsimonious, and parsimony is a very good thing. Bim's theory of self-perception is far more parsimonious than Fessinger's vision with cognitive dissonance theory. Think about all of the moving parts that you find in cognitive dissonance theory. We have this desire for cognitive consistency. We want our attitudes and our behaviors to match. Sometimes we don't find that they do, right? Sometimes we find that our attitudes and our behaviors don't go together. When our attitudes and our behaviors don't match, we have cognitive dissonance. And this cognitive dissonance leads to unwanted tension and arousal. And this unwanted tension and arousal, because it's negative, makes us want to do things to get rid of it. So we're going to change our attitude to match our behavior, or we're going to change our behavior to match our attitude. That's a lot, right? That's a lot of steps, a lot of parts. Bim's theory, I watch my behaviors and I learn my attitudes. That's it. So it's much more parsimonious. Bim's theory is much more straightforward, more parsimonious, and generally, that's a good thing. So parsimony, in terms of theory, is a good thing. We want theories that are as simple, as straightforward as can be. And we know that certainly self-perception theory is more parsimonious than cognitive dissonance theory. Well, that would suggest that self-perception theory is better, but doesn't necessarily guarantee that, right? Parsimony is good. We want things that are simple, but you can't have things that are so simple that you leave out important and required parts. For example, I can build a car that's really parsimonious by leaving out the engine, but that's not a car that will work, right? So if my theory has 3 steps and your theory has 5 steps, my theory is more parsimonious, and that's good, as long as my theory does as good a job of accounting for the social psychological phenomenon as yours does, right? I can't leave out parts that have to be there. So Bim's theory is more parsimonious, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's better. It's going to be better, but only if it does as good a job of accounting for the phenomenon. So the argument raged about which theory was correct, the more complex cognitive dissonance or the more straightforward and more parsimonious self-perception. Fazio, Zanet, and Cooper came along in 1977, and they made an argument, and it's a very good one, that maybe it's not which one is correct, maybe they're both correct, but they're actually both correct in different situations. And remember, law number 1 says that the situation matters, so this is pretty consistent with the vision that we would have of social psychology. Maybe it's not either or, right? Maybe it's not that dissonance is right or self-perception is right. Maybe they're both right, but in different situations. Fazio and his colleagues began their argument that dissonance and self-perception are both right, just in different situations, by stating that we have to understand the difference between the latitude of acceptance and the latitude of rejection. Latitude of acceptance is a situation where you are saying or doing or feeling something that is different from what you originally thought or felt or did, but it's not all that different. It's really pretty close. And then latitude of rejection would be where this new thing you're doing or thinking or feeling is really different. It's way different or in contrast to your original thoughts or your original attitude or your original behavior. So latitude of acceptance, something that's pretty close. This new thing about you that's pretty close. Latitude of rejection, something that's really different from what you originally would have thought. For example, let's say someone was asked to rate like 15 different restaurants in Murray, and they rated Dumplings as the second best overall, behind their first pick, Los Portales. Let's then say that that individual was asked to stand up in front of some people and say that Dumplings was third best rather than second best. Well, third best is not the same as second best, but it's pretty doggone close. So saying it's third best would be in their latitude of acceptance. It's not the same, but it's quite similar. But if they were asked to stand up there and say that Dumplings was the very worst restaurant, last on the list, that's really not even close to saying it's second best. Second best and worst aren't even close. Therefore, standing up and saying it's the worst of all restaurants would lie within that person's latitude of rejection. It's just not even near what we think. So staying with our restaurant example, if you think Dumplings is second best, but you say it's third best, that probably really wouldn't upset you very much. Having things in the latitude of acceptance probably wouldn't bother you or give you unwanted tension or arousal. You're probably just say, well, I said it's third best, that must be what I think. So in this scenario, when something is in the latitude of acceptance, you have self-perception that's going on. That's the argument that the individuals developing this theory, Fazio, Zana, and Cooper, would like to say. They'd like to say that when you have something in the latitude of acceptance, what you're saying is close, not the same, but close. That's not going to bother you. That's not going to lead to unwanted tension and arousal. You're just going to say to yourself, well, I said that, that must be what I think. That would be self-perception at its finest. So basically, latitude of acceptance equals self-perception. But if you say that Dumplings is the worst restaurant, when originally you thought that it was the second best, that's not even close. That's going to be in your latitude of rejection. You stand up in front of people and say Dumplings is the worst restaurant in Murray when you thought it was second, that's going to lead to unwanted tension and arousal. Unwanted tension and arousal, that's dissonance talk, right? That's dissonance lingo. So when you're in the latitude of rejection, cognitive dissonance is what's going on. Cognitive dissonance equals latitude of rejection. That's the entire point that Fazio, Zana, and Cooper are trying to make. That's where we say the situation matters. If it's in latitude of acceptance, then that's self-perception driven. If it's latitude of rejection, it's cognitive dissonance driven. So let's take a look at an example that would explain better, perhaps, Fazio's explanation of how both dissonance and self-perception theory are correct, just in different situations involving latitudes of acceptance and latitudes of rejection. Let's say there's a student out there that is asked to rate me as a professor on a 0 to 10 scale. 0, this person hates me with an undying passion, and 10, this person likes me so much that they purposefully flunk my classes so they can take me again. And they're asked to rate me on this 0 to 10 scale, and they say I'm a 6. Now they're asked to present in front of others and describe me as either a 5 or a 7. Well, the 5 or the 7 is really close to a 6, right? That's in the latitude of acceptance. So as they're standing up there talking and they're saying, yeah, he's kind of a 5 or he's kind of a 7, they're thinking, oh, yeah, well, that kind of makes sense, right? That's a self-perception thing. I just saw myself say he's a 5. I must think he's a 5. Now, 5's not that different from 6. It's in the latitude of acceptance. There's no like massive tension or arousal going on. They're just looking at their behavior and deciding, oh, I guess that's what I thought. But what if they were asked to describe me as a 1? Or what if they were asked to describe me as a 10? So this person thinks I'm a good professor, a 6 out of 10, but now they're going to say I'm the worst person they've ever had teach a class, or I'm the best person they've ever had teach a class. That's not even close, right? Now all of a sudden we're in the latitude of rejection. This is where cognitive dissonance is going to operate. If you stand up there and say those types of things, you're going to feel unwanted tension and arousal. You're going to have cognitive dissonance. So when you're in the latitude of rejection, dissonance is going to go on. You're going to say to yourself, well, I got this unwanted tension and arousal I got to get rid of so I can change my behavior. No, actually, I can't unsay what I said. So in order to reduce the distance, I might change my attitude about Dr. Wong. I might decide he's better or might decide he's worse. The third line of research, looking at attitudes, involves persuasion. Persuasion is defined as effortful attempts to get someone to change their attitude. Basically, this would be situations where people are really trying on purpose to get someone to change how they feel about something, to get someone to change their positive or negative evaluation. Now, to be honest with you, ultimately what they're probably after is also a change in behavior, but it starts with a change in attitude. So for example, if you go onto a car lot and the car salesperson is trying to get you to buy a car, trying to change your behavior and get you to buy the car, before you're going to change your behavior, you're going to have to change your attitude. So that's our basic bottom line fundamental component here. You're not going to get a change in behavior in all likelihood without a change in attitude. So persuasion then, a change in attitude due to pressure from someone. We'll take a look at several important components of the persuasion process. Specifically, we'll look at the influence of the persuader. We'll then examine the message itself, what's being said. We'll then turn our attention to the audience, the people actually being persuaded. And finally, we'll talk about resisting persuasion and a theory known as psychological reactance. The first component of the persuasion process we should focus on would be the influence of the persuader. Essentially, this would involve characteristics of the person that's making the persuasive attempt, the person doing the persuading. So think about the salesperson. This would involve the characteristics, the traits, the expertise, the knowledge, how this person is perceived, and how those characteristics and traits and perceptions can increase or decrease the effectiveness of the persuasive attempt. One important trait that influences the effectiveness of the persuasion process would be whether or not the persuader is viewed as credible. Credibility is a critical factor here. We're more likely to be persuaded by credible sources than we are sources that seem to lack credibility. So for example, if an individual is trying to figure out what the economy is going to do in the next 6 to 12 months, that person is more likely to listen to the CNN analyst than that person is likely to listen to Joe the bartender, because a person on CNN should have a higher level of credibility and therefore be a more effective person in terms of persuasion. Second important trait or characteristic of the persuader that has the ability to increase or decrease the effectiveness of the message is whether or not this person is viewed as trustworthy. Trustworthiness is a critical feature, and individuals who are viewed as more trustworthy are more likely to be successful in their persuasive attempts. A couple of things that make an individual seem trustworthy that can increase their effectiveness as a persuader. First of all, when individuals argue for a position that goes against self-interest, they tend to be viewed as trustworthy. So for example, think of a scenario where you read that Murray State's Faculty Senate has voted unanimously to recommend to raise tuition by 5%. And then you also read that they want to increase the library capacity and the technology capacity by 5%. You might say, well, I'm not really in favor of the tuition raise, but I can see that at least they want the money to go to a good cause. They would seem trustworthy. But if you found out about the 5% raise recommendation and then also found out that the very next thing they did was recommend to raise faculty salaries by 5%, you would just shake your head and say, yeah, no, there's no way. Because there's a lack of trust there, because what they're doing is going to promote themselves. It's in their own interest. A second way that individuals can be viewed as trustworthy is when they believe that we don't know they're there. This is the old hidden camera stuff they do in commercials. If you think the person talking does not know you're there, then you're going to think that what they're saying is authentic. They're not saying it just to change your mind. They're saying it because they truly believe it. If I thought that they knew that I was here, then I would think, well, they're just saying that because they want me to hear this, they're trying to get me to change in some way. But if you think, well, they don't know I'm standing here, so that motive is gone, then what they seem to be saying seems more truthful, more authentic, more trustworthy. Another critical trait that has been examined in terms of aspects and characteristics of the persuader that impact the success of the persuasive message is attractiveness. The simple truth is we like good-looking people, and research shows that more attractive individuals are more likely to be successful in their persuasive attempts. A final trait that warrants mention is similarity. We tend to be more likely to be persuaded by people that we see as similar to us in some way. similar in our backgrounds, similar in our likes or our dislikes, similar in our experiences, really similar in any way. The more similar the persuader is to us, the more likely we are to go along with what they say. So we've talked about 4 different traits and characteristics of the persuader that matters: credibility, trustworthiness, attractiveness, and similarity. But you can really sort of group these together, right? On the one hand, you can have credibility and trustworthiness. This essentially would be what the person knows, what the persuader knows. Then you can also have attractiveness and similarity. This is essentially what the person looks like, what the persuader looks like. A fair question would be, which one works better? Are we more likely to be persuaded by credible and trustworthy sources, or are we more likely to be persuaded by attractive and similar sources? Research says it really comes down to the topic in question. If the topic is factual in nature, such as how many miles is it to the moon, then you find that credible and trustworthy sources are more effective. If it's an issue of taste or preference, like what kind of tennis shoes should I buy or what's the best toothpaste, then you find that attractiveness and similarity rule the day. So if it's a matter of information or knowledge or fact, credible and trustworthy sources work better. If it's a matter of taste or preference, then all of a sudden attractiveness and similarity are the characteristics that are more effective. If you'll watch commercials, you'll notice this. If it's a topic that's factual in nature, the individuals asked to provide that information, they tend to be high in credibility and or high in trustworthiness. But if it's an issue of taste or preference, like what car you should buy, all of a sudden, all of the people that they hire to do those commercials are highly attractive and or highly similar. The second important component of the persuasion process involves the influence of the message. This is all about what's being said, the content of the message. 2 important aspects of the content of the message are one-sided versus two-sided arguments, and then also the primacy versus recency effects. One-sided arguments are arguments that only give one side of the issue. Two-sided, these would be arguments that are more balanced. They give both sides of the issue. So, for example, if I try and persuade you to change your major to psychology, a one-sided argument would be me just giving you all of the reasons why you should do that. A two-sided argument would be me saying, well, here's the reasons why you should change your major to psychology, but also then here are a couple of reasons why you shouldn't do that. In terms of the effectiveness of one-sided and two-sided arguments, what you find is that both are more effective in different situations. When an individual already believes what the person is saying, so in other words, if the individual is already pretty much sure that they're going to go along with the persuasive message, then one-sided arguments work better. Basically, you just want to go ahead and push the person over the edge, so to speak. If they're 90% sure that they're going to do this, just go ahead and tell them all of the reasons why they should do it. But if they're sort of leaning against this decision, if they're against what you're trying to say to them, then two-sided arguments actually work better. The reason that two-sided arguments work better in this scenario is because they're sort of against this decision. They're not in line with what you're saying. And if you only use a one-sided argument, you're going to lose credibility. You're going to lose trustworthiness. But if you give a two-sided argument, those additions of seeming credible, of seeming trustworthy, that might be what actually can successfully persuade someone. So again, to recap, if they already believe what you think, use a one-sided argument. Just go ahead and push them over the edge and preach to the choir. Go ahead and load up their schema with stuff they already think. But if they're leaning against this angle, if they're not really in favor of the message that you're giving them, a two-sided argument will work better. A more balanced approach will work better. So returning then to the example of me trying to persuade someone to change their major to psychology. If that person is 90% sure that they're going to change their major, I should use a one-sided argument. I should just give them new pieces of evidence that goes ahead and confirms what they basically already believe. But if they're only like 20% or 30% sure they're going to change their major, and all I do is give them a one-sided argument, if all I do is give them all of the reasons that they should change their major, I'm not going to seem credible. I'm not going to seem trustworthy. They'll probably know that here are a few reasons why they shouldn't do this. There are a few reasons why it would not be in their best interest to change their major to psychology. If I don't bring those up, I'm not going to seem trustworthy. I'm not going to seem fair. I'm not going to have a balanced argument, and therefore it's not going to work very well. Because they're already sort of leaning against me, they're only 20 or 30% sure they want to do this, a two-sided argument will work better. The primacy and recency effects, you very well may remember this from intro psych, or perhaps if you had a cognitive psych class. It's pretty common for professors in psychology in various courses to give students a list of words to memorize. So the professor will say, okay, I'm going to read a list of 10 or 12 words. When I'm done, I will raise my hand or I'll say the word right, and your job is to write down as many of these words as you can remember. And what you tend to find when people do that is they have a really good memory for the first things that were in the list, the first couple of words in the list, the primacy effect, or they have a really good memory for the last things they hear, the last words in the list, the recency effect. Well, if we have good memories for the first things we hear, primacy, and we have good memories for the last things we hear, recency, it shouldn't be too surprising then that we tend to be persuaded by the first things we hear, and we are persuaded by the last things that we hear. So let's say you and 7 of your friends are going to go to a movie. The Cherie Theater has 7 theaters here in Murray, and so all of your friends and you're going to head out to see a flick. Now, each of your friends wants to see a different movie. You don't care what the movie is, so long as it doesn't involve social psychology, you don't really care. Each of your friends then you're going to have them all line up, and one by one, they're going to tell why you should pick to go see their movie. After all, you're going to have the deciding vote. 2 votes is going to win. Each person then has 5 minutes to say why they think that you should pick their movie, and they go in a row. You're going to end up going along with what one of the first 2 people says or what one of the last 2 people says. You'll go along with the primary information, primacy effect, because that's what you remember and that's what will persuade you. Or you'll go along with the more recent information, the last things you hear, the recency effect, because that's highly persuasive as well. The 3 people in the middle, they're not going to get to see their movie. But let's change up our example a little bit. Let's say you only have 2 friends that want to go to a movie. Again, you don't care. You just don't want the movie to be about social psychology. Once again, you find yourself in a situation where you have the deciding vote. So again, you're going to have one person say what they think are the reasons why you should pick their movie, and the other person is going to have their opportunity to persuade you. Now, all you have is the primacy and the recency effect, right? There's nothing in the middle. So here's our question. If you've just got 2, what's more powerful, the primacy effect or the recency effect? So when all you have is the primacy and the recency effect, when all you have is 2 persuasive messages and nothing in the middle, what you find is, in terms of which works better, primacy or recency, is that it is a function of the gap between the 2 messages. It depends on the gap or the amount of time separating message 1 from message 2. If the messages occur back to back, then you get the primacy effect. This is because, well, your brain likes it easy, right? And so once you hear this first message, you think to yourself, well, I think that works out pretty well. And you don't even bother listening to the second message. Your brain doesn't want to listen to the second message. That sounds like work. So you just say, oh, that first message sounded good. That works for me. Off to that movie you go. But if there's a long gap between the 2, then all of a sudden you get the recency effect. And this is because you tend to forget what was in the first message. Now, yes, you could sit there and work really hard in trying to remember what the first message said, but you're probably not going to do that because, once again, law number 2, your brain likes it easy. So no gap, small gap, you'd get primacy effect. Larger gap, more time separating the 2 messages, you're going to get the recency effect. The third component of the persuasion process is the influence of the audience. This aspect of persuasion is all about who is receiving the information, that is, who is being persuaded. In a lot of ways, the impact of the audience comes down to the audience's ability to develop what are called counter-arguments. Counter-arguments are when the audience figures out ways to go against the persuasive attack. So, for example, if you find out that I'm going to try and talk you into changing your major to psychology, but you don't want to change your major to psychology, you might then start to develop reasons to counter my persuasive attempt. These counter arguments then will be designed to help you not fall prey to persuasion. The more the audience is able to develop counter arguments, the less effective the persuasion process will be. So what you find then is that if you warn someone that they're about to be persuaded, that actually decreases the effectiveness of the persuasive message. Because once people are warned, they then start to develop counter arguments. For example, imagine a scenario where you and your friends have decided that you'd like to go to a auto dealership and take a look at some of the new models that are out for sale this year. You aren't really interested in buying a car, you just want to go and take a look at the new models. Well, you know that as soon as you drive on the lot, all of those roaches of salespeople are going to come flying out of the woodwork and try and sell you a car. Well, what you do on the way there is you build in your arguments that you're going to say whenever these people show up to try and talk you into buying a car, right? I mean, on the way there, you think, okay, I'm going to tell them that I'm just looking, I don't have any money, I have no credit, I'm a terrorist. You're just going to try and figure out whatever you can say to these people to make them leave you alone. That's the effectiveness of having the ability to be warned about persuasion. Because when you're warned, when you know it's coming, then you develop counter arguments and it decreases the effectiveness of the persuasive message. We're less likely to be persuaded. So forewarning someone will decrease the effectiveness of a persuasive message because it gives them a chance to develop counter arguments. However, distracting someone increases the effectiveness of the persuasive message because by distracting them, you decrease their ability to develop counterarguments. Remember law number 3, that we have a limited cognitive capacity. So if you make people focus on one thing, that's less of their cognitive capacity that they could focus on to develop counterarguments. Salespeople are really good at this, right? They're constantly trying to distract people to take their mind off of why they shouldn't be doing whatever it is they're being persuaded to do. Think about, again, go back to car salespeople. They're constantly having sell-a-thons and parties, and they got balloons, and they tell you to bring the kids. They're trying to give you things to think about so that you aren't thinking about why you shouldn't buy the car. They're trying to give you things to think about, overload your cognitive capacity, so you're less able then to develop counter arguments, and therefore their persuasive message will work better. A final important component of the persuasive message involves resisting persuasion through what's called psychological reactance. This is the work of Jack Brim. So one of Brim's earlier jobs back in the 1960s was at Duke University, and he had one of those first job apartments that he and his wife Sharon Brim lived in. One of those apartments where the living room and the bedroom aren't separated by a hallway, they're separated by a door. So one morning, Jack was up early. He had a tendency to get up very, very early, like 3:34, 4:30 a.m. to work on his research and his lectures and things like that. He was up super early, and he looked over and he noticed that the door to the bedroom was open. And Sharon, of course, was still asleep because that's what, normal people do at 4 o'clock in the morning. Well, he didn't want to wake her because he knew it was being kind of loud, getting coffee and breakfast and shuffling papers and things. So he gets up and goes over and shuts the door so he didn't disturb her. About 30, 45 seconds later, Sharon gets up, opens the door, back up, goes back to bed. The very next day, Jack is again up super early in the morning. Sharon's still asleep in the bedroom. Jack looks over and sees that the door is shut. He remembered that yesterday she'd wanted the door open. Even though she was asleep, she wanted to have that newlywed connection, all that early marriage bullshit stuff. So he decides, well, since she wanted to open yesterday, I'll go open it for her. He gets up and opens it up. 30 to 45 seconds later, she gets up, walks over, and shuts the door. Sharon didn't want the door open. Sharon didn't want the door closed. Sharon wanted to choose if the door was open or closed. From that real-life event, Jack came up with his theory of psychological reactance. Psychological reactance is simply our desire to maintain our freedom of choice. We want to be the person who decides what happens. We want to have the ability to make the critical decisions in our lives. Sharon wanted to choose if the door was open or closed. She wanted to be the one in charge of making that decision. Think about a situation where you say, I want to go to a movie tonight, and there's 2 movies that you want to go to equally well. And you're like, I'll just decide when I get there. So you get to the movie theater and you find out that one of the movies is sold out. Suddenly, that's the movie you want to go to because your freedom to choose that movie has been taken away. That's psychological reactance, our desire to maintain our freedom of choice. So to test his theory of psychological reactance, Jack conducted a study in which a subject is met at the testing session with another subject. Of course, the second subject is a Confederate. And they get to the testing session, to the room, and there's a sign that says, please wait here. Once they're both there, Jack opens the door and says, hey, we're running a little bit behind, so we'll get to you in about 10 minutes. Just kind of sit tight. At that point, the Confederate subject says, hey, well, can I run a quick errand? And Jack says, sure, no problem. Just be sure you're back in 5 or 6 minutes. Jack goes inside. The Confederate subject heads down the hall and turns around a corner. About 2 minutes later, the Confederate shows up with, depending on where you grew up, a pop, a soda, a drink, a Coke, or a beverage, and gives it to the subject. What's critical here is that the Confederate made sure that the subject received this favor and didn't pay for it. So sometimes the Confederate would say, here, I got this for you. And the subject would be like, oh, okay, thanks, and take it. Sometimes the subject would say, well, let me pay you for it. The Confederate wouldn't take any money for it. Sometimes the subject would I'm not really thirsty. The Confederate would say, well, no, I don't want to waste it. Here, I got this for you. Take it. Well, okay. So the Confederate is going to make sure that the subject is taking this favor. That's one condition. And the other condition, basically the control condition, the Confederate just returns from this errand, doesn't bring a pop back, so there's no favor. So basically then we have two conditions in this study. The favor condition, where they return with the drink that they give to the subject, and the no favor condition, where basically nothing happens when they return. Now they're brought into the lab, and they're sitting basically face to face on a couple of small desks. And they're asked to do this impression formation task where, there's kind of asking questions of each other back and forth. At some point, Jack walks over to the Confederate's desk and drops a stack of papers onto the desk and says, hey, can you sort these in groups of 10 or 20, something like that. The dependent variable was whether or not the subject would offer to help. So once the stack of papers is put down on the Confederate's desk, would the subject go, hey, let me do some of those for you? Or maybe the subject would reach over and grab a stack and say, yeah, I'll help you out. That's the dependent variable, whether or not the subject would help. So we're trying to figure out, would they help more when they had the favor or no favor condition? Brim's results are often contradictory to what most people would think. Usually, we think that when someone helps someone else, that person that has been helped will return the favor. They'll help out in return. As a matter of fact, later on this semester, we'll talk about a norm called the reciprocity norm, which is exactly that. We tend to help people who help us and expect to be helped when we've helped someone. But that's not what Brim found. Actually, what he found was that when the importance of reactants was high, when it really mattered to subjects to maintain their freedom of choice, they were likely not to return the favor. As a matter of fact, he found in that condition that when they received the drink, they were far less likely to help than when they had not received the drink. Here's what's going on. When they are given this drink, this favor has been done for them that they didn't ask for, and they now feel obligated. They now feel like it's like their duty, their responsibility to help out in return. But we don't like that, right? We don't like feeling obligated all of the time. We want to be in charge of who we do and do not help. We want to be in charge of deciding, of making the call on who we help. So individuals that were given this favor, all of a sudden they had psychological reactants. They felt like their freedom to choose who they help had been taken away. Well, how do you reestablish your freedom to choose who you help? You don't help when you think you're supposed to. So these results are somewhat opposite what most people would expect. Most people think if someone has a favor done for them, they'll help out. But if their need for reactants is high, if their need to maintain their freedom of choice is high, they'll regain that freedom of choice. They'll deal with their psychological reactants by not helping. That's exactly what Brim found. Those in the favor condition actually were less likely to help out. So let's do a quick comparison of psychological reactants and post-decision dissonance. Let's say all week you've been looking forward to going to Dumplings for dessert on a Friday afternoon. And as Friday rolls around, that morning you wake up thinking to yourself, man, do I want cherry pie or do I want apple pie? Do I want cherry or do I want apple? Now, you can't get both because, you're not a pig. So you're like, oh, I can only get one, cherry or apple, cherry or apple. When you get there, you walk in and you say, and then the server says, well, what kind of dessert would you like? You're like, all day long I've been thinking cherry, apple, so I've finally decided I want cherry. And the server says, well, it's a good thing because we just sold our last piece of apple. Well, damn it, now you want apple. That's psychological reactance. Your freedom to choose apple has been taken away, and now that's exactly what you want. But let's flip the script a little bit, and let's say we're discussing this with respect to post-decision dissonance. You want cherry and apple the same. You pick cherry. Well, what would post-decision dissonance say? Post-decision dissonance would say, well, now you think that cherry's the best pick, right? Because you wouldn't pick cherry over apple and then think apple was better. That would be an inconsistency between your attitude and your behavior, and that would lead to cognitive dissonance. So this prediction would be, the prediction from post-decision dissonance would be that you'd want cherry more because you picked cherry. But remember, for reactance, if you pick cherry and you're told there's no apple pie, all of a sudden now you want apple pie because of reactance. We have conflicting predictions from these two theories. So to recap then, we have two different theories with two different predictions. The prediction from psychological reactance would be that, well, you picked cherry, but you're told there's no apple. Now you want apple. The prediction from post-decision dissonance would be you picked cherry, so you'd say, well, clearly cherry's the best pick. Two different theories, two different predictions, both theories developed by the same person, Jack Brehm. So I was sitting in one of Jack Brehm's graduate classes, and he was lecturing on this. I said, well, Jack, how does that work out, right? You have two predictions that are in opposite directions. Jack simply said, Dan, first reactance, then dissonance. Write that down. First reactance, then dissonance. So Jack's argument was that the first thing that happens is psychological reactance, and you'll have your desire to maintain your freedom of choice. But if for some reason you can't regain your freedom of choice, that's okay, because post-decision dissonance will kick in and will convince you that your decision was right all along. So let's return then to our dumplings example. All day long you've been thinking cherry or apple, which one do I want? You finally get the dumplings, and the server says, what would you like for dessert? You say, I've been thinking all day, cherry or apple, cherry or apple. I made my decision. I want cherry. And the server says, well, that's a good thing because we just sold our last piece of apple. Well, now the first thing that happens is reactance, right? Instantly, you're like, well, darn it, I want apple pie. Well, you now need to try and regain your freedom of choice. Well, that's going to be difficult here, right? What are you going to do? Go in the back in the dumplings kitchen and whip up a quick apple pie? Probably not. You might say, well, I'll just go somewhere else for apple pie. Your options are really limited. This is Murray, Kentucky. I think the only other place you can get a quick apple pie is McDonald's, and I'm telling you, at McDonald's, the apple pie and the filet of fish, same thing. So in that scenario, you may not be able to easily, if at all, reestablish your freedom to choose. You may not be able to deal with your psychological reactance. The good news is you won't be in a crappy mood because then post-decision dissonance will kick in. You'll think, man, I wish I could get apple. They're all out. Well, can I get apple? No, not really. Hey, that's okay. Cherry's clearly the best pick. Right now, all of a sudden, post-decision dissonance kicks in, and you convince yourself that clearly cherry was far and away the best decision to make. First reactance, then dissonance.